Greg, thank you so much again for your time today and for getting onto this podcast with me.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, I love doing podcasts and I love speaking to people and I love getting that interactivity and feedback. And I just
Mhm.
love kind of talking positively about Agile and just improved ways of working and collaboration generally. So there's a lot of shift away from Agile, but just talk about improved collaboration, ways of working,
Mm.
effectiveness, efficiency, and corporate culture is really always going to be universally important.
Mm. Okay, so talk to me and tell me a little bit about what is agile management.
Well, Agile management, I would say often we're seeing that managers don't really get agile.
Mm.
They're not really fully on board. We see this in the surveys that the State of Agile does, that there's disengagement, there's that frozen middle in big organizations of people not really being into Agile. And I think there's a few different reasons for that. One is that the things that teams do are not necessarily the same things that managers do or middle leaders.
Mm.
They're actually less interested in the frameworks, they're more interested in what benefits it brings.
Mm.
Sometimes Agile is brought in as a proxy for redundancies. We want to be more efficient, which means less middle managers. So there's a lot of corporate resistance there, which is just natural.
Mm.
Um, and really, when you start talking more about outcomes as a corporation, then that's a more productive conversation rather than, yeah, let's do a daily stand up. So I think, these are just practices, right? Let's talk about the things that really matter. Where's the business going? What's the strategy? Are we aligned? Are we all kind of supportive of one another? Or sometimes what you find is
Mm.
empires and power building. So these things come out in the surveys of management doesn't really get it, management's not on board, there isn't alignment, leaders are not engaged enough, all these sorts of things. Because to be honest, I don't think leaders are really that interested in Agile. They're simply interested in business success.
Mm.
And that's a universal thing that existed long before Agile was around.
Right, right. So when you work with managers as a coach on agile management, uh, how does it work? I mean, for somebody who just does not know what is agile management, how would you want to define it?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes there's an attitude of we're bringing in Agile because we've had a big consultancy kind of
Mm.
sell it to us and brought it in and it's sort of being installed. You don't really install a culture. So there's this conflict of it's being forced on us. We're not really
Mm.
interested, we're not really involved. And it's trying to bridge that conversation around, yeah, but what's useful to you?
Mm.
What helps you to be more successful? I,
Mm.
in my earlier career, was a software engineer, and then I was a project manager, and then I was a program manager, and then moved more into Agile. And I go, well, hang on, it's not Agile's over there and Waterfall's over there, and it's either or. It's a
Mm.
spectrum, right? There's nothing to say that in Waterfall you can't
Mm.
just get together and discuss things every morning. There's nothing to say that in Waterfall you have to wait for the end of a project to find out what went wrong. You can make notes as you go along and improve as you go along. It's a
Mm.
spectrum, so you can introduce agile practices into waterfall. It's almost like the saying, "I can't believe it's not waterfall," right? It's like it's about degrees and about adoption and about seeing where is it possible to improve.
Mm.
Continuous improvement is part of agile, and continuous improvement is bigger than just agile. So if you bring it more towards continuous improvement to say, as a manager, you want to succeed, right? What
Mm.
would help you to succeed? So where do you look to continuous improvement?
Mm. Mm. And I think so then manager requires different kind of thinking to be able to think
Yeah.
about continuous improvement. So what are the skills that you would want to have in such managers who are doing agile management?
Well, this is where I moved more into critical thinking, red team thinking, where there's a
Mm.
suite of 24 different practices, some of which teams are using already, like Think, Write, Share, some of which they're already aware of, like Kinefin, and some of which they may be using already, like Pre-Mortem is adopted by product managers. So trying to kind of get that sense of like overcoming the biases that we have,
Mm-hmm.
things like groupthink that's got highlighted with David Cameron quoting it in the COVID report of saying groupthink in the UK government led to bad decision making and how we handle COVID. One of
Mm.
the issues that we find is that often it's one or two managers making the decisions.
Mm.
And that has two fundamental problems. One is that if all the decisions go to those managers, the managers then become a bottleneck.
Right.
And there's a queue, and therefore there's a delay in decision making.
Hmm.
And secondly, if it's only a few people making the decisions,
Hmm.
they're maybe not making that decision in a holistic and integrated way, drawing on the experience of teams. So
Hmm.
the more we can draw on the experience of teams and the
Hmm.
wider organization, less relying on one or two, perhaps selective, perhaps from a particular niche background that's not representative of the whole corporation, the more holistically we can draw on the experience in the room and the experience in the organisation, such that there's then less pressure on managers because they're not really confident. I'm not quite sure about this. They then defer. We get stuck
Hmm.
in analysis paralysis, as you know. So
Hmm.
in trying to draw out effectively and efficiently the
Hmm.
knowledge in the team, the delivery stream or the organisation,
Hmm.
it then takes that pressure off managers and it removes the bottleneck. So we end up
Hmm.
with making better decisions because we've effectively distributed decision making. If you know the work of David Marquet, the US submarine commander, in Turn the Ship Around, he embodied that mindset of it's not about the captain making every decision. It's about relying on these trained professionals distributed throughout a submarine and
Hmm.
using their experience at the front line where they're seeing the action to
Hmm.
actually then trust them to make the decision and empower them with the appropriate delegation of authority, the appropriate skill sets, and the appropriate support from management. So
Hmm.
management is there to support rather than to take people's jobs away by disempowering them. So that's
Hmm.
really the challenge. And using these excellent role models of people turning around complex, critical, and dangerous situations quickly and effectively
Hmm.
by distributing the decision making and relying on the wisdom of the group. And the other benefit that then arises from that is, of course, it's a culture change.
Hmm.
And it means that management is less reliant on the prop of bringing in a big four consultancy because
Hmm.
they've actually found that that knowledge is already in the corporation. Like we
Hmm.
found this actually with Nike last year when they made a really big mistake in their strategy. They relied on an external consultancy group. The knowledge was already in the corporation. They dismissed that knowledge in the corporation, and their sales tanked because they had the wrong strategy.
Hmm. Hmm. So it's critical thinking, right? And I think it's a
Yeah,
decentralization of decision making,
yeah.
uh, and then utilizing the wisdom of the entire team and not just relying on the captain, right?
Yeah, and critical thinking is the process of overcoming our biases to come to the
Hmm.
quick answer, the safe answer, or satisficing. It's about properly and in a structured way analysing and dissecting the available information to come to a considered answer. And in doing so, it's involving that wide experience because that way you're drawing on that experience that's available and not letting, say, the loudest voice dominate and allowing everybody to participate in their own way. Because, of course, things like neurodiversity play a part. Some people are naturally extroverts and like to talk. Some people like to be quiet and considered, but
Right.
their contributions are just as valid.
Hmm. True. True. And how do you then develop a structured approach of critical thinking?
Well, as I say, there is some facilitation practices to work on. If you've ever used liberating structures, and these are facilitation practices, and it's like drawing on which practice makes sense. The critical thinking practices and red team thinking are a similar analogy. There's a palette of about 24, and really the skill is to use the right one in the right circumstances. Some are
Hmm.
more suitable at the start, and then it depends on where that journey goes because it's a bit like a coaching conversation. It's not a process. It's not do this and you have an answer. It's here's a suite of tools, and depending on the context or depending on whether you've got a plan in front of you or you're just considering speculatively what might be the plan, you use the right tool for the context. But as I say, think, write, share is a common one in which rather than just somebody speaks up and everybody then agrees with them, you perhaps give people a minute or two to consider their views on a thing, to mull it over properly so they're not just jumping to the first thing that comes to mind. Then they write down their answer or their thoughts. And science has shown, they've done studies of people's brain activity when they write things down. Different parts of the brain are then engaged. And the act of writing something down can then cause you to reframe your thoughts.
Right.
And having then done so, you're now committed, right? You put your answer up, and then everybody shares their diverse opinions all at the same time, and we see what that diversity looks like. A particularly good reason, and then so think, and then write, and then share as the process. And that's just universally applied across all the practices because it's a good way of bringing out the knowledge in the room. And it stops groupthink, and it stops us anchoring on what we think the boss kind of wants to hear. And it also shows diversity of opinion. Because if you ask an organization, are we aligned? Yeah, they'll probably say yes, right? They want to be aligned because the one that sort of we're all moving in the same direction to the same intent. But if you think, right, share in a boardroom or even just in a team to say, let's do this just to check, and you get different answers, then you're not aligned, right?
Right.
So it's important to be aligned. But before you even get to that, you can even use a practice called 6 strategic questions, which comes from the military, which is, what is the problem we are trying to solve?
6
And
strategic questions, huh?
yeah.
And
Which first is, what is the problem we're trying to solve? And then use Think Right Share on that to say, well, are we actually aligned on the problem we want to solve? Because the second one is when you've then moved forward that to get the alignment, then go, and is it the right problem? Because you might be choosing to ignore something that's really important because it's an uncomfortable truth. And then the third one is more like, if we're choosing to do this, what are we then choosing not to do? And making this all explicit and transparent is key to alignment.
so if we do this, what are we choosing to not to do? That's the third question, right?
And making it obvious. I mean, there's all these failures in the past, like Kodak and Blockbuster and so on. But even if they're just called out to say, we are choosing to prioritize film development and we're choosing not to prioritize digital cameras, right? An honest conversation and alignment could have perhaps helped them. Because as we know, back in the 80s, I mean, Kodak obviously went bankrupt ultimately, but we know that this was, like many business problems, self-inflicted. Just because the market was changing
Right.
doesn't require you to go bankrupt, right? Fuji was a really big competitor to Kodak's, and Fuji is still around
Right.
because they decided to be in the business of developing and materials and chemicals, and still are.
Right.
Right? Because they said that that's their business rather than relying on processing of of cameras. So it's interesting to see how many of these problems are in fact self-inflicted. And just because the market changes doesn't mean to say it's the end of your business. It's about anticipating this early, being honest early, and then having plans with optionality early by considering the future.
And Craig, I missed to write down. I mean, can we go through those 6 questions? That sounds very interesting for strategic thinking, I think, or critical thinking. So I've got 3.
Yeah,
What?
so it's kind of in 2 parts. Now, I say it's 6 questions, but often just asking the first and finding that there's a difference in the first one, go, that's fine, we'll just stop there. There's no point in continuing, right? And that has happened in banks to go, well, actually, we're not aligned. There's no point in continuing. But the other 3 are then like, well, so what's the fallout, right? So what will we look like? What will our customers look like? And what will the general market look like? So you're then considering, right, when you're aligned on the problem to be solved, you're happy with the things that you've decided to park, what will then be the impact of that decision to you, your customers, and the wider market? Because market dynamics will then play. You might want to play in a position of quality or mass market or speed or low price, whatever is important to you. It's about understanding how the bigger market dynamics then play out in terms of the company image, what the customers want, and also what the market dynamics will be in relation to your competitors.
Interesting. And talk to me a little bit about the red team thinking as well, because when you're a certified red thinking coach, and
Yes. So I was initially talking about strategy and did a strategy talk in October 2019. but I didn't really have I suppose, the research background to really identify what tools I was actually using, what I was talking about. I could tell that this was a valuable conversation. I could tell that identifying things early was a good thing. I had a visualization practice to support it. But what Red Team Thinking does is it plugs me into that this work has been done already, and here's what it's called. So Dr. Gary Klein came up with a pre-mortem, which is a bit like post-mortem, but nobody had to die first. So you're considering a future scenario in which there's a catastrophic failure of your company, and then you're working backwards to understand what are the preceding steps. And there's a structured way to do that. So for me, it gave me the labels, and also brought me into that community of terrific leaders that are already using these practices. Now, it's called Red Team Thinking because the phrase red teaming came about because in the early 19th century, the Prussian army was losing against Napoleon. And they wanted to kind of improve their strategy of, rather than going into the battle and losing, they wanted to simulate what could happen on the battlefield. So they set up wargaming, tabletop simulations of battles to say, well, some of us will play the part of Napoleon's army in red to simulate what could unfold on the battlefield. So we're ready and we're prepared. The Prussians were blue. Prussian blue, it's one of the first man-made dyes. And the simulation was pretended to be Napoleon's army, which were red. So this is where the phrase red teaming came from. It's about constructive adversarial thinking for a better outcome and to think things through. Although the practice of constructive challenge goes back much further than that, to almost the time of Socrates in ancient Greece, of just asking why and not pretending you have all the answers, but trying to draw the answers out through constructive questioning. So,
And
and this long history of moving from Socrates, we also saw it deployed by the Vatican, which was an interesting side conversation in Agile, to say the Vatican actually set up the office of the devil's advocate to constructively challenge applications for sainthood because there was too many. It was costing them a lot of money. And when people then knew that there was a process to go through and you had to justify a miracle, the applications for sainthood then went down. So it was a constructive challenge process that then had a positive impact. So constructive challenge as a way of thinking has a centuries-long history,
right.
but was really widely used in the military from about the 19th century, and especially became particularly relevant after 9/11, because the day after 9/11, the Red Cell was set up by the CIA to constructively challenge and analyze thinking and scenarios and model them such that the US felt it was better prepared and had thought through different things like, so why was it, for instance, that the pilots were trained to take off and fly, but not to land? Did nobody question why that might be a thing? So, it's really become very much integrated with the military, but very importantly, because these are key strategic decisions and key strategic practices in which the cost of getting wrong is very high, it's now being widely taken into business, which is now why we've seen this shift from red teaming, which is a separate team, to red team thinking, which is an integrated practice. So rather than
Okay.
having to set up a separate team, which doesn't really work well in business, it needs its own manager and line and cost center and funding. Red team thinking, but like agile thinking, is an integrated practice in teams so that they are challenging their own work and they are able to speak up and equal voices used. So it's a shift away from separate teams into a change of practice and ways of working. And it's proved really beneficial.
And how does this whole process of red team thinking, works? What's the structure like?
Well, as I said, there is a suite of practices. I mean, Think, Right, Share is one, Six Strategic Questions is another, the use of Cynefin is another by Dave Snowden, and that's just recognizing what type of problem we're trying to solve here. Is it complicated and we can understand it, or is it complex and we need rapid feedback and to try experiments? There is other things like argument dissection, assumptions challenge. There is a wide range, but it's about understanding what is the nature of the thing before us. Do we have a plan? And do we want to improve that plan by constructively challenging it? And it's all about constructive challenge. This isn't about being negative. This isn't about tearing people down. And this isn't about doing people out of a job either. It's about positive intent to say, let's make this plan better. Let's provide you with additional information and additional context and additional thinking such that the people that then made the plan can then consider this to go, how should the plan then be changed? And it's their choice to make the plan based on this information.
Okay. Okay. So, so you also mentioned about agile transformation. Yeah.
Yes.
Uh, what is that agile transformation?
So traditionally, many organizations, I suppose this kind of evolved in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Many organizations adopted what's called waterfall, which evolved out of a paper by a chap called Winston Royce in 1970, in which obviously back in the 80s, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have Google, we couldn't actually access that paper readily. And many people now have that access to that paper, which says, I believe in this method, but it is risky and invites failure. And it's interesting how it then became mainstream over the next 3 decades, and many big complex waterfall projects failed because they didn't go back to the source, which was much more about iteration and reflection and involving the customer regularly. But it became so simplified around organizational practices, organizational hierarchies, and accountancy practices that what we ended up with was organizations that were divided by function. So they'd have a development department and a testing department and an analysis department. And often these departments would be spread out and not co-located and not organized, such that decision-making became very difficult and required a lot of overhead and also lining people up so that if the developers wanted the testers, well, the testers were already busy. The testers had their previous project to deal with. And so it then became lots of management layers to facilitate this coordination of activity. Right. So what Agile brings, and Agile, again, has a long history, incorporates thinking from Kanban, which goes back to the 1950s in Toyota, incorporates thinking from iterative development, which originated in the early 1990s. Agile itself was really formalized a bit more in 2001, when 17 different thought leaders came together, wrote the Agile Manifesto that has 4 values and a number of underpinning principles. And really, it's about effective collaboration and responding to change better. So making it, in a complex, adaptive world, making it easier to respond to change and being willing to adapt to the fact that things do change because we can't have all the answers up front. Now, organizations have been recognizing this for a while. I think Agile delivery was adopted as mandatory in the UK government after about 2010 because they recognised it was a less risky approach to delivering big work. And it's been adopted quite widely around the world by teams for more than 2 decades around things like reflecting regularly, conducting retrospective regularly, and importantly, having teams that are multidisciplined. So rather than having a big development department over there, you have the developers, the testers, the analysts, the specialists, all in one team. Therefore, this facilitates rapid decision-making and turning around of information because it's these people that are closest to the work, right? It's not necessarily the leaders. The leaders may well have the strategic intent, but it's the people closest to the work that have the information. So by shifting this structure around so that it's multidisciplinary teams, and then you can scale that up. If it's a big project, you may well have 10 or 100 teams altogether. So you're layering that structure up and facilitating that type of decision-making around organizational intent and key results rather than here's the work, just get on with it. It's a shift, and it's a big shift. And it's also not just a shift in organizational structure and skills and job titles, but it's also a culture change too, because people are used to having lots of people reporting for them, being important, and to some extent that slightly erodes that. But then it creates a space for leaders to act differently, to act as more strategic leaders and to signify purpose and intent, like David Marquis in the submarine, rather than being busy in lots of meetings, having lots of conflicts and telling people what to do and being a bottleneck in the system. The system generally works better when Agile is done effectively. The difficulty, though, although there are so many advantages, the difficulty is that it becomes somewhat industrialized. And big consultancies keen to win business say, here is a framework, adopt this and you'll be successful. But it just doesn't work like that. It just
Right.
doesn't. You cannot install a culture. Culture emerges from the relationships and trust and confidence and ways of working and structures in an organization. And culture is an emergent property. So trying to install a framework, which there's a couple of named frameworks out there, but just bringing it in, well, you might get some benefit, but you won't get all the benefits, because the important thing is that, like individuals, every company is an individual too, with its own history, backdrop, what work it does, and that organizational context and where the work is done. So every solution needs to be tailored effectively to that organization. What you're doing in a factory building cars is not going to be the same as working in Amazon and you can deploy software every 10 seconds, right?
Right.
It takes a lot of time to make changes to the design and build and implementation process in shaping metal than it does to altering a piece of software on the website, right?
Right.
So the solution needs to be tailored to the context at hand.
And the problem is also very unique now. I mean, every problem is unique. Every industry has got its own way of perceiving and undergoing a problem. So, of course, the solution also needs to be tailored.
Yeah. The solution needs to be tailored. There are some things that are reasonably universal, like to actually understand what problem we're trying to solve here, right? First of all. And also, are we making work visible? Because by making work visible, you then identify two key things. One is there unnecessary duplication? And secondly, is there important gaps? So the principle of making work visible, where is the work, where is it getting stuck, and what work are we working on, is absolutely key. Because if you're actually going to come in and transform an organization, these are universal values of,
Right.
can we identify duplicate work? Because that is universally going to be waste regardless. And when you have identified that duplication of work and then stop that duplication of work, those people are then free to do the transformation work or other work or other more valuable work or to close the gaps, rather than you spending a lot of time, energy and expense recruiting people that you then actually didn't need.
So it's also the speed, right? Not just the
Yeah.
productivity. Yeah.
Yeah, so you can move faster then because you've got the right people on the park already, rather than spending 6 months doing recruitment and onboarding and security clearances and all the things that go with it.
And also, while now, I mean, the work is becoming agile and it's agile world, but I also feel now there's a remote working culture too. I think that
Yeah.
adds to the complication of how teaming happens in an organization.
Well, yes, and that's been a big debate. So Agile, you could think of it initially as being responsive to change, but it's also that reactive bit and it's the proactive bit. So there's two bits of Agile that balance really well together. And what we find is when we come up against things like remote work, which of course was a big thing in COVID and everybody was forced to work remotely, surprisingly many people found that they were successful. Because the other thing about Agile is it's often metrics driven, right? The metrics say this, or the customer data says that, or the ability to meet projects on time says this. This is the data, right? And data is not an assumption; it's what the data says. And one thing in Agile is we like to work with data. So if the data is saying we were more effective remotely, why should we change that? Right? Because apart from the data saying so, and independent surveys, I think the Chartered Management Institute in the UK did one, and you can also look at how people are feeling, and also look at broader things like inclusion. So, for instance, if people are actually happier at home, maybe because of neurodiversity or maybe because of mental health, could be that the workplace is better for them, could be that home's better for them. They might have a long commute. It might be difficult to balance that with caring commitments or children or whatever else. And of course, when you are tied to living near your place of work, that has disadvantages too, because it probably means you're in a city where housing is more expensive. And if that work sadly ends, then you might even have to move house, which is a big deal, right? So remote working gives us a lot of flexibility. And I found when I was working up in the north of Scotland in 2017, it really was. It was whiskey territory, right? But we weren't making whiskey, we were building software. And trying to find great software engineers was hard because it wasn't a big town. The nearest
Right.
city was at least an hour away, and it was not actually a big city either. So we had to embrace remote working, otherwise we couldn't get the skilled people in time. Now, I wrote an article on remote working and the benefits in 2017 on LinkedIn, but actually my history of remote working goes back much further than that, because when I was doing my master's, I'd already by this point had internet access for a long time. I wrote Britain's first guide to getting online, and I worked for a networking company. So we were collaborating globally back in the 80s and had instant messenger as well as email. So I saw some early benefits of it then. And so I said, well, remote working has a lot of benefits for people with disabilities, for instance, because of the difficulties of commuting or them needing adaptations to their equipment. And I also sort of speculated a future in which remote working would then take off. And I said, well, guess what? When we're all remote working, we're all just the same square on the screen. Everybody is one click away. You don't need permission to wonder where your manager's boss is and where their office is and get an appointment to log in. It flattens the organizational structure, and it makes it easier to access people outside your organization too. So there's a massive culture change I speculated in 93 that would then arise because of remote working, because it would make access to information quicker and simpler. Now, what we've seen now in the result of COVID, when everybody was forced remote, apart from obviously key workers, that people saw the benefits firsthand.
Right.
Many organizations were reluctant to embrace remote working prior to that, despite a legal requirement that for disabilities, they needed to make special adaptations for
Right.
people who perhaps might have a physical disability and for whom transport was hard, or even people with reduced immunity, for
Right.
whom going onto public transport meant they got sick more often because they caught colds and coughs and other things more often. People were asking for these reasonable adjustments long before COVID, but organizations just said, no, it's not a priority, it's too difficult, or we don't have the
Right.
technology. And these were the organizations that were actually caught out the most in COVID to go, well, let's think. In 2019, everybody had a desktop. We can't go into the office anymore. The desktops are sitting there doing nothing. In the past, only management got laptops because they were really important. Well, actually, now everybody needs a laptop, or we need the facility to have virtual working through remote environments that facilitate secure virtual working through our own equipment. And so there was a need for some companies to invest in infrastructure. They had to do that or go bust. A contact center had to function, or the company would probably go bust. So
Right.
because they've now made these technical adoptions, and we've now seen the evidence of effective teams, we now have this conflict of why not have continued remote working? Because, again, like when I talk about agile transformations, it's all situational, right? It's obviously quite hard in some jobs to do remote working, like if you're a nurse or certain teaching professionals where there's physical work, like shipping things around the country, right? Clearly, the nature of the work has an impact, right?
Right.
But also in the work that could be remotely done some or most of the time or all of the time, then there are the advantages. So we've got to play out the interplay of what is the work, what is the company's approach to supplying the appropriate technology and adaptations, what is the individual, do they have the right setup, the right equipment, the right space to work, do they have distractions, do they have good internet, do they have the right equipment, and also about the circumstances of the individual getting to work, because do they have a short commute, do they have a long commute, do they have a reliable commute, is there train strikes, is there bad weather, all these things interplay to go, well, actually, I might prefer remote working most of the time, but I'm going to come into the office to run a workshop. Or I live a long way from the office, I prefer remote working most of the time, even though the office is fabulous, because of the cost of the commute. Or my health is really bad
Hmm.
today, but I feel I can contribute remotely, but I've got a doctor's appointment. All these things interplay to form a pattern in which the main solution is flexibility. Right?
Right.
Design something that you can be flexible, accommodate change, but
Hmm.
also importantly, you are measuring the effectiveness and output of the teams. So you see the work is being done. You see people aren't slacking off. You're having regular check-ins. You've got visibility of the work, which is
Hmm.
key in Agile, to have visibility of the work, to see that it's progressing towards done. And you're seeing, importantly, the difference that makes in the organizational
Hmm.
outcomes and the customer outcomes. Because sadly, the executives saying we're more effective in the office are often absent on statistics. Show me the statistics of effectiveness before, show me the statistics now. There's a lot of this power play going on of they really just want people back in the office because they perceive it to be useful or
Hmm.
it works for that individual, but it doesn't necessarily work for the person in the wheelchair who's got challenges using public transport, for instance, or who has neurodiversity and wants a quiet space to work. So
Hmm.
therefore, flexibility is the key, but it is balanced with assessing and measuring the effectiveness of the work and the work getting to done rather than
Hmm.
speculating about it being done because you see
Hmm.
a person on a seat to go, well, they're obviously busy, they're sitting there in front of their terminal. But do you know that? Is it
Hmm.
making a difference, right?
Right.
So as a change in organizational thinking around measuring the effectiveness of work rather than being focused on hours spent and where you're sat.
Hmm. However, there are organizations who are now against the working of remotely, and they are saying that no, we need to have people come back, and maybe because they are more focused on the type of work than or the location of the work rather than focusing on the productivity and the outcomes of the work.
Yeah, well,
Uh,
this is the problem. Is that show me the data. Like, it's a difficult thing to have because obviously Big Boss runs the show. And I always say, but do you have data behind that, or is it just an opinion? And again, you can use critical thinking individually to analyze this to go, where could this decision be coming from? What's the motivation? What's the data? Because of course, if you had data, you'd bring it
right.
to the party and show everybody, right? So it's an easy win when you've got data. But the
Right.
fact that there's no data is, well, that's a bit harder, right? So it could just be around we want a busy office. Or it could just be, well, hang on, I think my pension's got an investment in property in the city centre, but I'm not going to let that on, right? I'm just not going to say that because obviously that's going to let the cat out the bag, right? A lot of it, I think, is around that, about the impact on city centre property values, around people who with a vested interest in commercial property being high, rather than saying maybe the city centre is for people to live in. I mean, I'm based in Edinburgh, and although there are a lot of offices in Edinburgh city centre, there are a lot of people living in Edinburgh city centre too. Unlike the City of London, where hardly anybody actually lives, it's all like skyscrapers and multi-stories, right? So there's a shift there. And there's that sense of, oh, well, I'm a big boss and I've got a bigger, more important and larger office than everyone else. And I enjoy that sense of importance and my gold, shiny marble floors or whatever they all are. My sense of importance is a bit diminished when I'm on a chat and everybody's the same size. There's a lot of that egotistical thing. And to be fair, these people got successful in the era before video conferencing, which really only took off in the last 10 years. They got successful on the basis of handshakes and corridor conversations and of personal networks and of
Right.
after dinner meetups, right? And all that stuff is really threatened. So their modus operandi, their method that worked for them is no longer the method that's best in the future, where it's about collaboration, it's about flattening the organizational hierarchy, it's about drawing on experience from lots of different places, and it's about undermining these often dysfunctional organizational silos, which are thinking silos and power silos. And an executive turning up to a half empty office isn't necessarily a great look when you have your visitors over. So there's a lot of psychological dynamic at play there. But what we are seeing is a shift, because that's what, if there's two companies next to each other dealing in investment banking, and one says you can work remotely here and the other one says you can't, where's the talent going to go, right? So a bit like,
Right.
a bit like people used to wear suits and ties university, right? I've worked in banking now and people don't, right? Anything like as much. it's a culture shift that's come with generational expectations. And I think that although some companies were already embracing remote working, some companies embraced it more because of COVID and the technology improvements, and some companies have been reluctant. What I think will happen is that over time, the ones that are reluctant will become increasingly isolated and increasingly less attractive to work for. So we'll see them struggle a bit more to get the right people and to have the right culture, and to also suffer from perhaps higher turnover, because as life circumstances take over and you have a family or you have caring commitments, it's simply going to be easier to balance work and life and be more inclusive, particularly impacts women as well, and disabled groups. So it's more inclusive. So you get a wider pool of people to draw from if you have inclusive work practices. You can't say that your organisation of value is inclusion when you're then acting in a way that is uninclusive.
Right.
You know, this is one of the practices we use in Red Team Think. It's lies we tell ourselves. Are we saying one thing but doing the opposite? And there's a structured way to work that through to a positive outcome.
And and Craig, it's so fascinating to hear you and listen to you about your concepts of remote working. And you've been, I think, almost 10 years working for remote working when I think it was not so even common.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was 2017 I wrote this analysis of when I was working in North of Scotland about remote working. I also worked for a bank, and I also worked for the a public sector body. And they both embraced this concept of 3 days on site, 2 days off. And I said it was a nice mix and provided a lot of flexibility. It also cut down costs. But it was actually in 93 that I wrote a paper on remote working as part of my master's, because I'd already been doing it. When I was working for digital in the 1980s, we had instant messaging. We could send something like WhatsApp and it would arrive in another office around the world instantly. And we had email. So we had these benefits of remote collaboration. And it was in 1989 that I trained up somebody remotely. I'd never seen what they looked like. There was no web back then to show pictures or share them. But I trained them up, they were successful, and then I got offered a job in the US based on the ability to train somebody up remotely and them to be effective. So if you measure effectiveness and outcomes, we could do it back then in the 80s. And of course the technology has got much better since then.
Right. Right. Yeah. And with AI, I think it's going to go to the next level now.
Yeah. And it is sort of kind of funny in a way, some of the companies that develop cloud applications, some like Atlassian have been really, really big on remote working, and other companies, one of the telecoms companies in the UK, but benefited massively from remote working because they were providing infrastructure. As a corporate practice, they were actually wanting everybody in the office. There's a real dichotomy of, yeah, we're selling this to everyone else and we're selling it to you as employees, but we're not letting you work like that because we want you in the office. It's a real contradiction there.
Craig, it is wonderful talking to you today. If I were to learn more about agile management, agile transformation, and all of the work that you do, how do one get in touch with you?
Yeah, so my name's Craig Cockburn, and my URL is www.craigcockburn.com. That takes you to a spread of links, one of which is my LinkedIn, others of which are my conference talks. And of course, Red Team Thinking is www.redteamthinking.com if you want to learn more about critical thinking practices.
Okay. And by the way, what was your topic around in the conference that you did
Yeah,
in
so it
Bangalore?
was aligned to Red Team Thinking, but because it was an Agile conference, I tailored it for that audience and said, look, see, with an Agile, we have leaders making decisions. We want to make better decisions, and we want to be more proactive about that decision making, so that we are able to kind of get a slightly better glimpse and slightly better insight of how the future could unfold, to have optionality and plans. So it was tailored for them. So people who are product owners or product managers or heads of product, or actually coaches that then support these people, are actually then saying, hang on a second, wait a minute, if we think about the customer, or if we think about quality, these things are universal, right? Let's not think about there's a quality department. Let's everybody have that mindset about quality or improvement or customer centricity. So if we all have this attitude of making better decisions, then it will become much more embedded as a corporate practice. And of course, these leaders will benefit. But if we all embrace it, we all benefit. And we can deploy it at every level of the organization too.
Amazing. Craig, thank you so much for this conversation today.